My name is David Miller, and I want to welcome you to the My Camp podcast brought to you by Happy Camper Live. I'm hosting a very special series called My Camp Lives On. As we know, there are thousands and thousands of camps that are operating here in the United States and all over the world, but there are also some camps that unfortunately have closed their doors. Some closed their doors decades and decades ago, some within the last number of years. But the thing about camp and camp in general is that many thousands of campers and staff made it up the camp road, down the camp road, through the camp gates, and spent summer after summer at these camps. And their memories need to live on. And this is an opportunity that we will bring on a number of these camps that are no longer in existence, and people who went to the camp and worked at the camp to talk about the experience of what those camps meant to them. Tonight, we're talking about Camp Samoset. And Camp Samoset was a camp for boys that was in Maine. And I'm going to ask right now our guests to introduce themselves. Seth?
Seth Lieberman, Camp Samoset, 1979, first year.
And Seth, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Hastings-on-Hudson in Westchester County, New York.
And you started Camp Samoset in 1979. And how many years as a camper were you there?
I was 7 years as a camper and an additional 7 as a counselor and athletic director, administrator, all those sorts of things.
That's very cool. There's nothing better than starting out at your camp as a camper and then graduating through as a senior, upper senior, whatever they called it, and then coming back and being a staff member. And our other guest, Colin, introduce yourself, please.
Colin Burgess, Camp Samoset, 1973 to 1987. I was a soccer counselor. I was then head of upper camp and eventually assistant camp director. And I was at camp for 15 years as a counselor, just a counselor.
So what's very cool about our guest tonight is that Seth follows the path of growing up at camp and being a camper. Colin actually came over from the UK as a counselor through a program called BUNAC, which is a program that brings college students from international college students over to the United States to work at a camp. And then after you work at a camp, you get to go and travel. And the idea is that you do that for 1, maybe 2 summers. Colin, how many summers?
15 summers.
Yeah. And then Colin, what happened to you after you stopped working at Camp Samoset? Was that the end of your camp career?
No, it was not, because I then went to work for the company that brought me over. I went to work for BUNAC, and that was from 1989 until 2012.
So it's so interesting, right? How one summer at a camp, and this was Camp Samoset, can completely change your life, and you become a camp professional your entire life. Right, Colin?
That is 100% correct. And when I got the job, it was through a guy called Graham Bailey, who had been at Camp Samoset in 1972. He was the only British counselor there that summer, and he was recommended by one of his buddies from St. Luke's College, and who was working at Camp Cedar, which was just down the road from Camp Samoset. And he recommended Samoset to Graham. And then I happened to play soccer with Graham a few times, and he offered me a job at Camp Samoset, to which Steve Feinstein, the director, said, absolutely no chance. He's not that good a soccer player, and he's only 19 years old. So we don't need him. And Graham, and I have to thank him for this because it changed my life, Graham said, I promised him a job. If he doesn't come to camp, I'm not coming to camp. And Foon then panicked and said, all right, he's hired. And that's how it started.
So the last question I'm going to ask you before we get into Seth, I'm going to ask you to tell us about the history of Camp Samoset, because we haven't even said where it was located and the lake it was on and all that. Colin, how many counselors and staff in your career would you say you have placed?
Wow, that's a very interesting question. Well, in my career with BUNAC, I would say it's thousands. I mean, at Samoset, I was very picky on who I chose from my friends at St. Luke's, who I brought to Camp Samoset. And I'd say probably over the years, at least 30 or 40 kids from St. Luke's went to Camp Samoset. And then, of course, when I interviewed for BUNAC, if I interviewed someone that I thought, you know what, you'd be very good at Camp Samoset, I would then recommend them to Camp Samoset as well, which of course the people of Bunac weren't very happy about that, as you can imagine, because I picked some pretty special guys who were excellent counselors.
I've known Colin for 25 years. Colin's probably placed 10,000 students in summer camps in the United States, easily, over the years. Seth, tell us the history of Camp Samoset.
I'm gonna pick up Samoset from when I started, and then CB is gonna take over going backwards. But Camp Samoset was located in Casco, Maine, 04015, on Pleasant Lake. It was, by most camp standards, a pretty small camp with a huge lake, a beautiful waterfront. And I would think for me, that's what, well, it didn't attract me necessarily as a little kid, but definitely my parents sending me somewhere that I could swim in the summer and do competitive sports. CB, pick up and give the early history of camp, please.
Well, Camp Samoset 1 was actually in Guilford, New Hampshire, and it ran for about 30 years. And then Manny Winston got an offer he couldn't refuse to have not a camp, but just some sort of property there. And he decided to sell camp in 1968. And Steve Feinstein, who was the head counselor, wanted to keep camp going. And he actually rented a property in Maine, in Turner, Maine, for one summer. And then in 1969, Camp Brunonia was put on sale, and Foon and Steve Shatkin, the other director, bought Camp Samoset. And they went, and the first year of Camp Samoset 2, as it was called, started in 1970.
So, of course, what you have heard now twice out of Colin's mouth is Foon. So that's the beauty of camp, because anyone watching this that didn't go to Camp Samoset has no idea what that is, because camp is about nicknames sometimes. What's that about, guys?
Seth, if you can answer that question, good luck, because he's never really explained it to me anyway.
So his name was Steve Feinstein, correct?
Yeah.
And everybody called him Foon.
Most people didn't even know his name was Steve Feinstein.
Not only did everyone call him Foon at camp, but everyone's parents called him Foon. His license plate says Foon. My friends growing up, when I would refer to camp, they've never met him, but they all know the name Foon. His brother's name was Jeffrey, and he went by Fenton. There were so many nicknames at camp, and that's just, you only knew people by one name, whatever their nickname tended to be.
So Foon ran the camp. Basically, he bought Brunonia. Now, Brunonia was a very popular camp with kids from the Boston area, and had some pretty famous alumni go there. As a matter of fact, in my last visit to Samoset, in the back of the kitchen, holding up a wall, is the original Camp Brunonia sign that I actually have a picture of. Did you guys ever see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. If you make it through to the oldest, at the time that I was a camper there, you become a waiter, and you get the luxury of paying camp. This is maybe the irony of camp. We would pay to go to camp to serve 3 meals a day the entire summer. And one of the unjoys of being a waiter was you got to do the hole, and that was the person that collected all the slop that came in from the meals. So you would have a day where you were really in the back of the kitchen, hence knowing ins and outs, the Bernoni sign and other things.
Right.
And I should add, you got $50 for the whole summer, and that your parents paid a lot for you to get $50, but somehow Foon pulled that off too.
Well, we didn't get paid much more as counselors, so don't get too upset about that.
Yeah.
So in terms of like memories of Samoset, I would say that in its heyday, probably, right, Seth, about the time that you were there in the late 80s, early 90s, 350 boys would be at that camp, and it wasn't that big.
Yeah, we had, I think the high number was 1988, before the Foon sold camp. There was a change in ownership. But at its heyday, I'd say it was about 300, 325, and it was definitely busting at the seams. There was not an extra blanket to be had all through camp.
Well, that's like when you went into the camp, there was like a hump in the middle of the field going down because what was that about, guys? Colin?
Yeah, the septic.
Well, that was to do with the septic system. Everyone was incredibly unhappy because it did kind of ruin how camp looked. It was this big lump in the middle of camp, which didn't exist. There was just lots of trees, and it was lots of people were very unhappy, but they had no, because it was such a small camp. I don't think it was more than 35 acres. It may have been 40, but I think it was 35 acres. And there was no place to put the septic system. And when you got that many kids, you had to have a septic system that works. And as Seth will tell you, it didn't always work. Tell them what used to happen, Seth, when it wasn't working.
I'm not sure I can. I'll let you share that one.
Well, do you remember what it was called when it used to, an alarm went off when the system failed? It was called the duty alarm.
The duty alarm, right? The duty alarm. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about a little bit is, in some of yours, Seth, probably as a camper, right? Take us back to like that first year and some of your first, like your earliest memories of being at an all boys competitive sports camp and how you felt when you first started and then as you started to make your way through summer after summer after summer.
I think for me and a lot of the guys in my bunk, and I went through all 7 years. I think there were 10 or 11 of us that went straight through 7 summers in a row. But we all came there probably at the age of 8 or 9, thinking we were great at a sport or a terrific athlete. And then you look at both sides of the bed next to you, and there was a kid who also felt that way. And it was a great place. You could do what you wanted. I've never been to another boys' camp overnight. So I don't know, but it was a place where you could run around all summer and do what you wanted. And the rules, like the rules at all camps and schools, have changed over the last 20, 30, 40 years. The stuff we did then and the jokes and pranks wouldn't be allowed now. But it was a place that you knew in the summer you were going, like any camp today, and playing sports all day and seeing your friends and the counselors, such as Colin, coming back year after year after year. And it's what kept us going. I mean, the memories that we talk about on the phone all the time, and when we have reunions, and we had 5 years ago a party for Foon's 80th birthday. People flew in from all over, and then this past June we had an 85th birthday for Foon in Rhode Island. And how many, CB, did we say 80 people were there?
It was at least 80 people, and for a camp that effectively closed in 2009. That is pretty amazing, to say the least.
And it's not just that the camp closed in 2009. When did Foon sell the camp?
Foon sold after the 1988 summer. And so
go back even further. So he hasn't run that camp since 1988. And yes, you guys got 80, and you guys, this is the reason for these podcasts, right? Okay. You got 80 people all these years later to celebrate his 85th birthday and actually go to Rhode Island. Not, I'm sure it was a lovely place that you went to, but it wasn't Casco, Maine.
Right. And to be fair, myself and a couple others who are my age, the rest of the people that were there were 5, 6, 7 years older, 15, 20, 30 years older. So people that hadn't been to camp since 1960 were at this, or who spent one summer in 1970 were there. I mean, and it's all camp owners, I'm sure, have the same, as you know, David, it's the same pull. People want to go back to their youth and remember the good times. And that's what brings us back with all the memories.
Well, I think, one of the things we talk about a lot in camp, and you guys know this, is that you can be anyone you want at camp, right? Well, whoever you are at home and whatever that existence may be, when you go to camp, you truly are your authentic and your best self. I fully believe that, and I know you guys do as well. Colin, what's your earliest memory coming over as a young soccer player, football player?
Well, very good question. First of all, I was very lucky to have Graham Bailey as the head of soccer, because he was a senior at St. Luke's College and I was a little freshman, and having him as my boss was fantastic. And Foon was so worried about me and what I was going to be like as a counselor. He put me in the senior bunk with Wally Feldman, who is a legend at Camp Samoset.
Definitely.
he was so scared. He put me with Wally, who is probably the most senior counselor and a superb guy. But kids were, for a man that was what, 5'4", kids were terrified of him. And Foon was so worried. And after 2 weeks, Foon went to Wally and said, "I've made a mistake here. Colin's too good to be with you. I need to move him into another bunk." And Wally, in his voice, went, "There's no way you're going to do that." And Foon got the message that I wasn't moving. And two of my campers, and Seth knows both of them, Andy Lewis and Dr. Dave Bindleglass.
Yep.
Absolutely still best of friends with. I mean, the great thing about camp is, Seth and I have stayed in touch all these years. And David, I've known you, by the way, 32 years. I met you in 90, if I'm not mistaken.
True.
And all I can tell you is the camaraderie is amazing. I had a 50th birthday party in New York City.
Last year?
No, I wish it was 18 years ago.
One of the best parties I've ever been to.
Most people thought it was my wedding. The number of people that said it's the best wedding I've ever been to. I said, well, that's good because it was my 50th birthday party. And we had 96 people there. It was, and yet again, a restaurant in New York that doesn't exist anymore. And it was one of the great nights. It was fantastic.
It's funny. It's funny when I was 18 years old, I went back to the camp that I worked at, and they put me in the bunk with the owner's son, who was the boys' head counselor, because they were worried that I was so young and whatever. And it was that 1 year, and like within the first couple of weeks, it was the same thing. Like they knew I could do. My next 4 years there, I always got the BUNAC counselor, who was one of the tripping specialists, that was on a camp the entire summer, and I took care of the bunk myself. So CB, you and I have a little in common there.
I love that.
Well, after my first summer with Wally, I never got a good bunk ever again. I was always put into a bunk that was either troublesome, because after my summer of 1977, I was teaching in England, so I used to come for half the summer. I would normally arrive literally the day before visiting day, and then I would take over whatever bunk, and then Foon would just say, "Well, don't worry, we'll solve that problem. Colin's going in that bunk." And that continued. I was 32 years old and still in a bunk, which is pretty amazing these days. David, I doubt you have very few 32-year-old bunk counselors, correct?
Yeah, zero.
I will say one. You're asking about memories at camp. One of my memories is what Colin just shared. Is when a counselor would either come early or come late, we'd have this grand announcement in the dining hall. And if they were leaving, you'd pound on the tables and wish them well. But they'd always introduce Colin. It was usually at breakfast. He'd come in that night, and there was a big to-do and stomp on the tables. And Colin, to his true credit, knew all of us and didn't skip a beat, would go around as if he was the president or the mayor of Casco, Maine, and come around to all of us. And that's what, among other things, keeps this bond so strong to this day.
Cool. I want you guys to tell us, and we have this is a PG rated podcast, but come on, guys, we need some pranks and some funny stories that went on that live in infamy. Let's just say.
You go first on that one, Seth.
I'm trying to think of some. So at Color War at camp, Color War at Samoset was a huge deal. I've worked at a few different camps, and it's not necessary to me. Color War at Samoset was the best thing I experienced, but it was different. Each camp does it differently. So for us, it was other camps did it better in different ways. But we had a big Color War break, and what that meant was the discovery of how Color War started. They played a recording of Inagata Davida, if I'm correct, CB.
Yeah, that is correct.
On the loudspeaker, and it was the drum solo from it. And the legend was, when the drums stopped, Color War started. And so it played all day from reveille until lights out, till it got dark. And it was just all day, the pitter patter, pitter patter, pitter patter. And if for some reason it stopped, campers would freak out. And it was started to play a couple days before Color War. And amongst other things that happened was the oldest group, the waiters, usually the seniors, would have a prank. And so one of the pranks we talk about was, we used to have little box cereals, which they don't, I'm guessing we don't really have anymore at camps. But you all, you recall the small box cereals, and the waiters had opened up hundreds, I mean, 600-700 boxes of cereal, and they had photocopied in what was now like the purple, photocopy, and it just said color war, go to the bell. So we had a bell outside of camp, to ring. And as campers started opening them one after the other, and counselors, especially kids that didn't know what they were doing, the younger ones just followed everybody else, and the entire camp ran out, and Foon and everybody else had to convince us the color war wasn't happening. So at the time, on this, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but in camp terms, it was a huge prank. It was a huge deal.
So was color war, just for clarification, you had two teams, maroon and gray,
Yes.
correct? And was it a short thing, or did it go from like a certain number of days? Because some camps, right, have color war that goes from the beginning until the end of the summer. That's the first camp that I went to. And then other camps have like a much shorter 5 or 6 or 7 day thing that is either called Olympics or color war. What was yours?
Similar to Olympics, it was 4 days. It tended to start at night, and so the following morning was the first day. You go 4 days, and if it was a tie, it went down to the last event, which was called waiter softball, and then they changed the term from waiter to PC, privileged camper, and it was PC softball. And in our world, we just played that game out. And I was part of 2 different color wars, and Colin did this as well, as being an officer, a lieutenant, or a general. So I was a general my first year. The first year that I was in color war, as a leader, I was a general, which is the highest honor a returning camper can have, bar none. No award can replace being a color war general.
Is that when were you up against Scott Rosner that year?
That was the second year.
Okay.
So the first year, it came down to the oldest group, softball. It went into extra innings, and my co-general was the head of baseball, Vance Owens. We'll give him a shout out. And without going into the story, we lost on a very controversial moment. And the prize at our camp for color war was simply getting to run into the lake. The entire group, the half of camp, it's split, one side gray, one side maroon, runs into the lake, and the generals run swim out to the raft and stand up on it, and you try and all the campers, and you try and dunk the raft, I guess, sink the raft.
Right.
Something that would never happen again at a camp anymore.
Colin, what, you got a prank for us?
Well, all I can tell you is that in those days, camp ran for 8 weeks, and we're talking, literally 53, 54 days. And what happened was, obviously, when Florida changed how kids had to leave, would have to have left in the beginning of August, and the camp would have had to have changed whatever we'd done going forward. But for those days, we used to have kids 6 years old that would stay for 8 weeks. They were in the bunk 1, as they called it, and some kids were in bunk 1 for like 1, 2, sometimes even 3 years.
3 years was the high.
Yeah.
Who gets that shout out?
Winghead.
Huh?
A Florida guy named Winghead. That was his camp nickname.
There you go. So Winghead, 3 years, bunk 1.
I believe it was Winghead.
Not the greatest camper in the world, I would have to say, but a character, I think, is the best way to put it.
Yeah.
I would also tell you, David, very interestingly, Seth was never my camper, and I think that's why we still speak to each other these days. Because Seth was very clever, because his best friend at camp was a kid called Brett Berman, who was by far and away one of the nicest kids ever to go to camp in the history of Samoset.
True.
And Seth, very smart, used to hang out with Brett Berman.
He aligned himself so he would fly under the radar.
At Foon's 85th birthday, my former counselor from 1981, Mike Sherman, and I stepped aside from the gala from the party for a little bit to call Brett Berman in Phoenix, so the 3 of us could catch back up again. And it's one of those kind of camp moments where I could never replace those 10 minutes. Were maybe my favorite 10 minutes of the entire event.
That's awesome. Mike Berman's he's from Newton, isn't he?
No, Brett Berman's from Pittsburgh, Shady Side guy.
That was your
You're right, though. Yeah, Michael Sherman's from the
Oh,
Boston.
Sherman.
Sherman is from Newton.
Yeah, he's a Newton
Yeah.
guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I know who he is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I
He said
knew
he knew
him
you.
a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
Got
Yeah,
it.
he was one of the great campers of all time. And I love him to death, and we're still best of friends. He was one of the worst counselors in the history of the world.
Right.
Which is why
Isn't
I
that-
loved him. Which is why I loved him.
You know, we talk about often, right? Just because you were, and it works both ways. Sometimes you're a better counselor than you were a camper. And other times you were an amazing camper, but you just can't make that transition into being a counselor
Yeah.
and realizing, oh, I work here now. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely right. 100% correct. And I'm sure, David, you have guys that come to camp as a counselor and they're okay, they're decent, but we used to call them a one and done because they were okay, but
Right.
they were never coming back to camp again. You know, they weren't going to be invited, and you know, it would be, generally speaking, it was a fairly select group, as you can imagine. To be counselors at a camp, I mean, we had a return rate of campers of maybe 85%, and we had a counselor return rate of maybe 50%.
Right. Which is always difficult because kids go on and need to study and whatever it is. So if you got
Absolutely.
together that group of, 80 people that were at Foon's party and you wanted to talk about the top traditions, right? Like what made Samoset in your minds different and special that you could ask anybody that ever went there, even if it was for 1 year, and you say, what was this? And they will tell you exactly what that meant to them.
I'll take that. Bunk feast. CB, you agree?
I would say competition.
Well, definitely competitions, but Bunk Feast was an event that you didn't have to, it was towards the end of the summer. And in our day, you had saved up all your nickel can refundables and you got your canteen money. And it was a night that you set up and you ate as much food as you could, lobsters and pizza and steak and steamers and you name it. The counselors left camp all afternoon and went shopping, and each bunk just ate and ate and ate until you can imagine the outcome. And so that is something, when I talk to people from camp who didn't go back as long as we did, they always ask, remember Bunk Feast. Definitely the competitions, the hatred you would have for another camp, similar to a Yankee Red Sox rivalry, you had that within the camps.
And who did you feel was your number one hate on camp?
Camp Cedar. No
Really?
doubt.
Yeah, definitely.
Not Takaho, huh?
Takaho would have been up there.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Casco's top 5, definitely.
Oh, Takaho's top 2. It would go Cedar, Takaho. I don't think there was a 3.
And
Androscoggin. And partly because these were the camps that were really competitive, and these are the ones you wanted to play.
Right.
The camps that weren't as competitive, we didn't see as a rival, so it wasn't a hatred, if that makes sense.
These are for our audience. These are single sex, all boys camps, and very sports oriented camps. So when Cedar would play Samoset, or any of those camps would play each other in intercamp, especially as you got older, some of those soccer games and some of those basketball games would get a little testy.
I mean, so Cedar was a couple miles away from Samoset. Takaho was only a couple miles farther. Androscoggin was a little bit of a ride, but to this day as well, all of us that went on to play high school and college athletics and a high level of coaching, we can remember those games. But the games I remember even more is the 15 and under Cedar basketball invitational. Those are the things you never forget, some of these camp moments.
Got it. Colin,
Well,
go ahead.
I was going to say to you, obviously, Jeff Hacker. You could
Yeah.
not have met a more competitive. When he was a camper, first of all, he was an excellent athlete at everything, and he was ultra competitive.
Right.
But Cedar always used to say, oh, Samoset's the really competitive camp. We're not that competitive. Well, that was crap. I'm sorry to put it that way, but it was, because they were as competitive as anyone. Would you agree, Seth?
I would agree. And to be fair, they were great camps. All these camps were great camps. It's just they weren't our camp. It's the old speech. They're the same as us, except they're not at the right camp. It's one of those deals.
Love it. Colin, any traditions because you only saw camp from the staff side, so any kind of things that the staff would look forward to that's shareable?
Yes. I would say that one day of the week when you were allowed to leave camp and you had a day off. And of course, you know Maine fairly well. Ogunquit was always the place we wanted to go to, and
Right.
that was back in the day when a little bit of drinking was allowed on the beach, which obviously does not happen anymore. And when you became a senior counselor, the great thing was you got Saturdays off, which was just fantastic. You were part of a big tradition. And I would say, staff used to get 3 days, 3 nights off a week, but there were no rules. But if you came back and you were intoxicated, you would lose. If you weren't fired for being horribly intoxicated, you would lose 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights off. You would lose them because you could tell straight away. The senior staff would know straight away if someone couldn't perform the next day.
By the way, this is a water for the record. It's water.
Any what kind of any kind of special trips that you guys remember going on, or
Yeah, sure.
any stories of
Yeah,
things that might have gone on a Samoset trip?
I do have a great story. I won't mention the counselor, but we took a trip as you got older, like a lot of these camps now. We took trips and we went to Montreal. The stories are legendary, but on the way up there, we were pulled over by a trooper, the state trooper in somewhere Maine, and they took our counselor was from I don't know, somewhere in Alabama, I guess, somewhere down south. And at the end of it, he said to the cop, "I'm never coming back here," in some words of that nature. And he took the ticket, and as he drove away, he just let it all litter out the window. And you can imagine the impression it had on 15-year-old boys. We just thought that was the most amazing thing. And about a mile down the road, we got pulled over again, and one of those things. But it's just it's those are the memories, kind of the mischief, the fun mischief, I think.
Think about the year, right? So how many boys were there?
Say it again.
How many boys went on that trip?
That would have been actually I don't know, in the waiter bunk, maybe 22 boys, two vans worth.
How many counselors did they send?
Maybe 2.
Maybe 2, right? And how old were those counselors?
19, 20, 21.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Things don't happen that way anymore.
Oh, things have changed dramatically. I mean, the stuff that went on. I mean, David, you and I have talked about this. As a counselor, nowadays, I would fire myself. I mean, that is true. The stuff that went on, the jokes with the kids, all of this stuff, it's so PC now. It is. We used to look. They used to think the Brits were a little strict because we're all going to be teachers. But we had a counselor called Brian Bowers who is from Florida, absolute character. But he was very strict, and for the first couple of weeks, in the bunk, the kids, they went on with one group that quite a few of them from Canada. They went to Foon to complain that he was too strict, and Foon, to his credit, said, "You'll end up loving this guy." And we spoke about this at the reunion, and Brian said that ended up being his favorite bunk of all time, and they were a great group of kids. But he was strict. He had rules and regulations. They had to make their beds. They had to do this. They had to do that. And some kids didn't like that.
I'll share another quick out of camp story. We took one year when I was a counselor. We took probably 45 boys to Cape Cod. So you can imagine getting the hotels and all this sort of stuff. And I won't say who was in charge of the trip, but we had one boy who was really sick or had the flu or something. So we all decided to do the old, let's wake him up at 2 a.m. and tell him, you're late, you missed the bus. And so we woke him up. He comes running outside, and we're all out there with our bags packed. He sees us. He goes inside. He takes a shower. He comes out. He gets on the van, and there was a note, go back to bed, or something of that nature.
Yeah.
You could never do that today.
No.
You could just unbelievable. And I think the legacy of Samoset for me, as I looked up to Colin and the guys that I referenced at Foon's parties, we wanted to do what they did. So all the pranks they played on us in 1979, we wanted to play in 1989, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So to carry on that legacy.
Besides all the great sports programs and the competitiveness of it, what else did the camp sort of did they have any kind of sort of hobby or theater or any kind of program, or this was truly, because I can tell you, where I ended up at, at Takaho, the Senior Big Show, which was the big musical, was a big deal, and it was very important to Morty Goldman, who was the director, and they had Hobby Row and stuff like that. Samoset was a much smaller property, and you guys used literally every inch. There was no land that was undeveloped there because you couldn't, right? You needed everything.
Yeah.
So was there any other programs that you guys can remember?
Yeah, totally. We did arts and crafts. We virtually everything. There were kids that went to Samoset that were not good athletes, and they still loved camp. I mean, we used to put on one show. Was it one? Yeah, it was one show a year, wasn't it, Seth?
So my memory is totally different as a camper to a counselor. If my response would be, we really didn't do much. We did have arts and crafts, but it was very limited. You cut something that was pre-cut out of wood and you painted it and gave it to your parents on visiting day. You might have learned how to make a lanyard. Again, this might be in the late 70s. The big non-athletic events to me were, we had mayoralty, which we elected a mayor of camp, which was a one-night special event, which was, that's how I learned, I think, about politics through camp and voting and electoral votes. We did song night, which you do a parody of a song. And so that was, those are the songs we won't now, but we could still sing or rehearse a line or two.
Part of Color War, or a night sometime in the middle of the summer?
Separate than Color War.
There's a song night in Color War. Absolutely. Yeah.
Song night was a serious night. The other groups, or that was group sing in Color War, but song night was totally different, where you could basically make fun of anyone, the counselors, Foon, do your thing. And it's kind of like boys camp, boys rules, which again wouldn't fly these days.
And what about individual? What kind of were there awards? I had been once I remember I went and visited and I saw the dining room. So if you guys can just sort of, and this is where you're going to get real reminiscent, right? If you can think about, the rafters and the plaques and whatever, tell our audience about, what made that dining room special.
Oh, the plaques. Absolutely. There were plaques all over. I'm not going to show you because you could have me arrested, but sitting up there in front of me is the 1983 plaque, which I've had since camp closed. And these plaques are very special.
I found the 83 plaque. I found the 83 plaque.
And no, those plaques weren't bunk plaques. What were those plaques about?
Color War, maroon and the lieutenants and generals, and then all of the winners. There was, the Goldberg Award. There were different awards for, it was the most prestigious thing at camp. Would you agree, Seth?
Well, as someone that voluntarily never won an award,
there's a reason for that.
Yeah, there was an award for the best lower camper, the best upper camper. They were named after someone at camp that had passed away, more often than not tragically. But those were a big deal. They were given out the last night of camp. The plaque was covered in a sheet, and they'd announce all the winners, and then they'd come up, and it was a big deal. But summer after summer, you'd sit there, and there was a time that I could probably tell you the 1947 Gray Lieutenant, just because my seat stared there for an entire summer.
Well, I can tell you that our audience right now is looking at a picture of a plaque that I actually took when I visited Samoset back in the right around 2007, and it's the 1990 gray maroon plaque, and the generals are Scott Rosner and Seth Lieberman. And then you guys are seeing it now. You can read it. It's Sven Smythe and Carrie Amato, and you have got your 5-year club and the Goldberg Award, the Lazarus Award, the Gould Award. So, Seth, I came prepared to have you as a guest.
You did, and it's fun. And joking aside with Colin, that's obviously the only plaque that I've ever really wanted. So I'm glad at least you have it. Someday I need to get back up and at least get a good picture with it, with Rosner, no less.
No, I don't.
one
I
of the-
just have a picture of it. I don't have the plaque. So what do you got there? This is what I want. Show us that. What do you got?
I don't know how I'm going to be able to show you. Every year, at the end of the summer, kids have left camp. There is a summary of the whole summer and who's there and color war and everything. And that is 1975 when I was on the cover with two campers. I still remember their names, David and Danny. Great kids. I hate that picture, and I've always told Foon that. But then again, right here now, you will see someone you might know because that is Seth's plaque from 1990.
Wow.
And
1991.
When go ahead.
How many of those do you have?
I have every year I was at camp. I have one.
And do campers sign the inside of them, or you leave them pristine?
No, you get them mailed to you at the end at some point in October. They were mailed, so you didn't get. We used to get a photocopied write-up summary of the summer, and it was basically the summary of a couple things, couple events, and color war. And in the back, it had all the counselors' addresses. Is that right, CB?
Yeah, that is 100% correct. Yeah.
And it used to have groups, the color war songs in it, I think, if I recall.
This is something I wanted to, David. Andy Stearns, who was at camp for many, many years and a very good friend of mine, and Seth knows him very well, one of the great guys of all time. His 60th was in Atlanta, and there were 10 former staff members at this event. And at the end of the event, we all sang the camp alma mater, which, unbelievably, I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but I can remember every word of the camp alma mater as Seth can, and I'm sure everyone else.
Right. So so of course that's how we're going to end this podcast, gentlemen. And I'm not quite ready yet, so you can take another sip of your water and your seltzer, because you're going to belt it out for me, really nicely. Now you also had some trophies in the dining room, did you not? What are those from? Tell me what those are from.
We had trophies as you entered from one side, and those were all the tournament plaques that we won at whatever the sport was. The tradition there, as I remember it, I think, you would present it. The head coach would say the results of the 13 and under soccer tournament. The MVP is. They'd announce the name, and the boy would come up, get it, and then you got to put it into the trophy case, and the entire camp would clap. And this is only if we won. There was no second place trophies at our camp. Nobody cared.
I like that. I like that.
And everyone would make this huge thundering applause and banging on tables, and it was a cool tradition.
Tell us about the last day of camp and each summer. Was or the meal before the banquet? What was kind of special about the end of a summer at Samoset?
First of all, we had a banquet on the night before the end. The leaving day. The night before, it was always a big tradition. There was lots of awards. There was lots of applause. There was, for counselors that have been there a very long time. There was always something said. Foon would get up and say something, and then we would. Seth, you can do the next bit. We would then go to the waterfront.
Yeah, we go to the waterfront, and the numbers were built out of wood, and they were lit on fire and pushed on a canoe. Similar, I'm sure, a lot of like other camps, and it was pushed out into the lake. And a couple of counselors were swimming in the water with it. All the docks at camp were already out, which nowadays everything stays perfect till the kids disappear. But the docks were already out. Every ball had been put away. You went to bed. Your bed, usually you slept on a gross mattress without anything because you'd already packed all your stuff up. I mean, to think about that alone would shut a camp down these days. And you woke up, ate, got on a bus, and away you went. It was It wasn't
was
early
great.
wake.
Lots of tears, and the great thing about Samoset was you you would see 75% of the people that were in that room on the last day, you would see them the next year.
Right.
I'd say the most amazing. I mean, I could say this 100 different ways, but here I am, 40 plus years removed from Camp Samoset where I started, and I bump into people at where I work right now, and they say, "Oh, you went to Samoset? My old neighbor was." And before they get the first name out, I'm saying the last name.
Right.
So it just, as we all know, whatever camp you're at, that legacy just never leaves you.
There's something also very special about the size of the camp. It's not, it's not the oldest kids know the youngest kids, and the
Oh, yeah.
youngest kids just cannot wait to be you when you're the oldest camper.
That's a really, really good point, and I would say Samoset did a really good job with that. Do you want to say what we did with new campers?
Yeah,
Seth?
so you had a Camp Big Brother, and somewhere I have it in my parents' house, I'm sure. But we had your Camp Big Brother would write you a letter because that was the only way to communicate, and you'd write them a letter back, probably one. And then over the course of the summer, the first day you'd hang out with them. Usually, it was a member of the 5-year club, and the 5-year club went to a Red Sox game. And so they'd come back late at night, among other things, and your big brother would wake you up at 2 a.m. with cold pizza and a drunken frap milkshake, and that was a highlight of your summer when you were 8. But your big brother, your camp brother, for the most part, did activities with you now and then, and you wanted to be that guy.
Who was your big brother?
My big brother was David Levine.
Not the great athlete, not the easiest kid in the world.
But he won senior cross country in color war.
Were there any clubs within a club? Any clubs within the camp like they did like throughout the summer that you would be a part of? Or
there was a 5-year club that went to the Red Sox game. And then there are multiples, the 9-year club, the 10-year club, and so on. But I don't know that we had specific clubs that.
I don't know. It was
all sports.
I mean, David, I'm sure you have kids that stay at camp for years and years and years. It's much more difficult nowadays because there's so many other things they can do when they get to a certain age. But it was never a question with most of our guys. They were at camp from age 8 through 15, and it was never a question. They were always there.
Right. And the sad part about it is that the physical camp no longer exists, right? And it's a shame, and that's why we're doing this podcast, because I know that there's going to be a lot of guys that went to Samoset that this is going to bring a big smile to their face, and then there's going to be other people like me. The first camp that I went to that is featured on this podcast series as well, Camp Belgrade. I was there when I was from 1971 through 74, and then moved on to Tuckahoe for a long, long time. But those formative years, 8, 9, 10, and 11, I remember those experiences. And to this day, if I could go back and recreate that property and do it again, unfortunately, they're houses now. You guys know what happened to the property at Samoset?
Oh, I'm sure I can tell you a little story.
Yeah.
It's about 4 years ago now. Norman, Paula Ford, who are from Maine and were at camp for many years, we went into the property and we were having a little tour of the property. And the caretaker turned up, and basically I thought we were going to get arrested because we were, it was private property and we were just looking. There's not much left of it now, David. There's like 3 bunks left. It's pretty sad to go there and see what it is now because it's not the camp that we knew. But the nice thing was Norm, being a Mainer himself, started speaking to the caretaker, and apparently they knew each other and they were at high school together. So the guy let us take a tour of the camp and go around, and we weren't arrested, I'm pleased to say. So
and it has not been developed into.
No, it was supposed to be a horse they were going to make it a horse farm for the family, the owner's family, the people that took the property back. As Colin said, they took a lot of bunks down. The dining hall's there, and it's falling apart. The rec hall's there.
The rec hall's been done up, and it looks good.
I've been on it a few times. We've done some reconnaissance missions to get a couple of artifacts here and there. But for the most part, it's I mean, it's fun just to go to Casco, Maine, quite frankly, just to be within feet of where it was. But it's clearly it's not there.
Right.
But David, also, when I first started going to camp, there were 7 other camps around our lake. And now there's Camp Arcadia across the lake, a girls' camp. And that's pretty much it. Seeds of Peace are down where Powhatan used to be.
Yep.
Right.
That's it. It's from 7 camps to essentially 1.
I ended up at Samoset. My sister went to a camp on that lake, Camp Truda, a girls' camp that had closed down also, which
Right.
is now condos.
So what's so interesting, right, is that there was like a period of time, you know, in the 80s and whatever, where a number of really, really good camps closed. I mean, now everybody knows the camping industry is booming, and there's great camps, and there's camps that have been around for years and years, and there's new camps, and there's camps that have come back in a new generation and stuff like that. But there definitely was a period of time where camps like Belgrade and Samoset and the other camps that we're featuring on this podcast series, you know, are no longer. So before I ask you guys to end by singing the alma mater, any final thoughts, CB?
Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and just talking, the love of our camp is, as you can tell just from what we've been talking about, is amazing. And the fact that I still have my closest friends in the world, I mean, I've got some in England, obviously, but are my camp friends. And the fact that Seth and I, you know, and we were a couple of years apart, have remained friendly for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I mean, I was on the phone earlier today with 2 camp friends, telling them about tonight, kind of getting psyched up for it. Obviously, talking with Colin. If there's one thing we could do, CB and I still talk about it. You know, we might be just getting past it, but get our hands back on a camp and do it all again.
I would love to. And what else we used to do, and Seth will agree with me, is that a group of us used to go skiing up in New Hampshire. Some of us good, some of us not so good. Seth and I are in the not so good category, but there's some great campers, former campers, that came and joined us on these trips, and they were fantastic.
I'd say one thing about, for me, in closing of camp, at least in our day, it didn't matter who you were or what you had at home, whether what your parents or your means were. When you were at camp, you were just at camp, and it was just, let's have fun. We're all doing the same thing. There was no value other than all being the same camp.
Right. Well, I want to thank you guys for having Camp Samoset's memories live on through this podcast. And now I'm going to ask you guys to sing us out. So on the count of 3, let's hear the Camp Samoset alma mater. 1, 2, 3.
In a vale
of pine and birch trees,
beneath a hilltop
tops high, stands a camp
I
all admired against the eastern sky.
Can we love
Samoset,
all
hail to thee.
May
Thy
sons
son
be proud
proud and loyal to thy memory.
Days done, gone the sun from the lake,
from
the hill,
from the sky.
all is well,
safely rest. God is nigh.
Thank you guys very much. It's been a pleasure to have you, and it's been awesome talking about Camp Samoset.
Thanks, Dave, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for the Happy Camper Live My Camp Lives On series of podcasts, and we'll see you on the next one.
Take a moment to shine on Happy Camp